south and in
now the second speaker will be Professor Hans Köchler. Are you ready? It's okay. Your microphone. Yeah, yeah. Good.
I will share with you some of my reflections on the G20 summit and its implications for world order. I have been asked, and I agree, at the request of the organizers, to prepare a written scholarly text, and I assumed that this should be presented, but now circumstances have changed, and I will only give some few ideas, and I will publish that, or will put that online, my analysis in its complete form within the next few days for those who are interested in it. The G20 is essentially the brainchild of the United States, Canada, and Germany, countries who in 1999 launched it as a project aimed at international financial stability in an enlarged G8 framework at the time. At that point in time, Russia was still a member of that group. The initiative brought together a number of industrialized and emerging countries chosen by the initiators, in particular Larry Summers, the United States Secretary of the Treasury, and his Canadian counterpart, Paul Martin, in coordination with the German Minister of Finance, Hans Eichel, who by some is even seen as the person who actually came up with the idea. Those politicians were the de facto arbiters of eligibility of members from outside the G8 area. An undeclared rationale may have been to co-opt emerging economic powers into the Western fold after Russia had been admitted to the G7 in 1997, making it for a few years the G8, until, as we know, global politics reversed this, what I call opportunistic enlargement in 2014, when Russia was expelled. Whatever the de facto founders may say to the contrary, the Western bias of the G20 is also obvious in the group's inhomogeneous membership structure, to put it mildly. What would be the G19 is actually the G20 because the group's 19 member states are joined or complemented, should I say, by the European Union as equal member. It means a cohabitation, to use that term here in France, a cohabitation of sorts, where European Union members, Germany, France, and Italy, until recently also the United Kingdom, are overrepresented in a hardly justifiable way. Except the European Union, no other intergovernmental organization has membership status in the G20. Organizations from the non-Western world, such as the African Union or ASEAN, were not invited. If one is truly concerned about global financial and economic stability, as the founders of the initiative claimed to be, there is simply no organic reason why relevant intergovernmental groups from outside of Europe should be excluded. In view of these statutory facts, so to speak, and of structural constraints, Indonesia's success as chair of the 22 summit was indeed remarkable. That it was possible to issue the final document in the form of a joint statement of all members, namely as it is called, the G20 Bali Leaders Declaration, speaks to the diplomatic skills and statesmanship of the Indonesian presidency. Under circumstances of major global crisis and a serious confrontation among some G20 members, due to the ongoing war in Ukraine, many international observers considered the drafting of a final document a mission impossible. Its eventual adoption under the consensus rule of the G20 as a joint declaration, not merely a communiqué of the host country, was a promising sign of at least elements of common purpose or unity among the member states. However, because of these the many conflicting political interests between the Western Bloc and the other countries, inconsistencies in these very lengthy and detailed documents were unavoidable. The inconsistency is particularly obvious in the wording of the internationally most widely reported paragraph 3 of the declaration, which acknowledges a split among G20 members over the war in Ukraine. The position of those who condemned the Russian aggression is reported almost in the form of a news release, quoting literally from the language of the respective resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations. It is evident that inclusion of this topic was the result of intense pressure and lobbying by Western countries. That this was condoned somehow by Russia was mainly the success of the host country's diplomacy. What made Western predominance in the group even more poignant was the lopsidedness in the handling of this inconsistency as regards the ambiguity between declaration and communiqué. Power politics, one might say, was allowed to shape the declaration, but only according to Western priorities. Other issues, such as the humanitarian catastrophe because of the aggression and the war in Yemen, were carefully, of course, excluded because the Western powers would not have allowed this balance in the document. The invitation of the President of Ukraine as guest speaker was further evidence of the predominant influence of the G7 over the G20, which has meant politicization of the global economic agenda according to the strategy of Western powers, bringing the emotions of war into the meeting. The President indulged in a novel form of diplomatic affront, repeatedly referring to the G20 as the G19, and not because he meant that the EU should not be a member, but he meant that Russia is not a member, with the aside that was not in any way, with this aside that was not in any way statesmanlike. He not only insulted Russia as a member, but also made the presidency's, I mean the Indonesian presidency's effort to preserve the G20's unity of purpose even more difficult. Fortunately, as I would call it, the opportunism of the moment, informed by Western priorities, not those of the host country, was not allowed to derail the summit. If I may just make a few more remarks before I conclude concerning the declaration, particularly noticeable in this voluminous document of the G20 leaders is the peculiar absence of any reference to unilateral economic sanctions, one of the key issues of and threats to today's global economic order, not to speak of peace and stability in the most general sense. The final declaration of what essentially was meant to be an economic summit does not in any way address the elephant in the room, namely the use of economic coercion for geopolitical purposes. Frankly, there would have been no declaration at all should a member have insisted on inclusiveness of the declaration in terms of such a basic issue of the global economy. The United States and European Union's policy of unilateral economic sanctions, often also extraterritorially enforced, is not only in violation of international law, but also wreaks havoc on the global economy and severely impacts the livelihood of the less privileged. It makes no sense to express support, and I quote from paragraph 29 of the declaration, support for strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth, end quote, if the economically strongest member states of the G20 at the same time engage in cruel collective punishment of entire peoples, as is still the case, for example, with the United States sanctions against Syria. Getting back to what I said at the beginning, or what I tried to explain at the beginning, a realistic, honest, and fair assessment of what has been achieved in Bali must pay attention to the structural invariables of the G20 on the basis of which the Indonesian presidency had to operate. It was the Prime Minister of Norway, Jonas Gahr Støre, who in 2010, when he was Foreign Minister of Norway, said that the G20 risks to sideline or undermine existing intergovernmental organizations with universal membership, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, or the International Monetary Fund. Unlike these organizations, with their statutory responsibilities and mandates, the G20 has no clearly defined functions or procedures. Its composition, not changed since the group's foundation, was determined by the major players of the G7, as I said earlier. Thus, in the assessment of the then Foreign Minister of Norway, it is, and I quote, a grouping without international legitimacy, end quote. He, the Foreign Minister at the time, now Prime Minister of the country, sternly warned of the consequences if informal and non-transparent power mechanisms are allowed to shape the global economy. And I quote from his interview one more time. He said, "We no longer live in the 19th century, a time when the major powers met and redrew the map of the world. No one needs a new Congress of Vienna," end quote. Indonesia, to conclude now, Indonesia did its utmost to mitigate the problems, namely the imbalances due to the diverging interests and the contradictory strategic outlook of the member states of the G20. And it eventually succeeded in the adoption of a joint declaration, which is really comprehensive and addresses all the major issues concerning development, environment, and fair and balanced international system. All these issues are included in more than 50 detailed articles. Under present circumstances, no host country from among the group of the emerging powers will be in a position to counterbalance the combined influence of the United States and the European Union on the functioning of such an essentially informal body, operating in some sense, I would say, in a Davos-like format. And I say at the present, under the present circumstances. This may change in the future, and we see already certain signs. And the Indonesian diplomacy has made clear to us in what direction the developments may go. However, at the moment, it is this kind of realpolitik one has to accept, though not to approve, in a grouping in which there is no balance of power and where non-Western countries effectively have been, in the year of the foundation of the G20, have been co-opted to be part of an enlarged G7. Until such time when a balance of power will emerge within the G20, there exists no real alternative, in my assessment, to universal membership organizations that operate in the framework of the United Nations. Those organizations can only be sidelined at the expense of fairness and sovereign equality, a basic principle of the UN Charter and of any just world order. And with that, I conclude my presentation, and thank you for your attention.